So there's, talk in society about artificial intelligence and the ways that it might make society better, but also lots of ways in which it's changing the world, and change can be complicated for people, especially if it's changing their jobs. I'd love to hear, how are the breeders feeling about this app, and how are the farmers feeling, both about the improved crops they're getting, but also as you're starting to do deployments into these farms, how are they experiencing the technology itself?
So far with the breeders and breeding technicians, they've been really positive. There's a lot of fear with AI eliminating a bunch of jobs, but this is actually an AI enabling jobs. Because the same people are doing the same thing, they're just doing it with less effort and getting more quality information and data from it. So from their perspective, it's actually making their life easier, but employing the same type of people. Same people doing more and better work.
Welcome, David. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
Let me start all the way back.
Okay.
I know that you're really interested in how the world feeds itself, and we're going to sort of come at this from a bunch of different perspectives. Okay. But I'd like to start with the plants that we grow and eat, most of the calories that humanity gets. How did we get to those plants? Tell me a little bit about that thread, and then I'm going to ask how your interests sort of collided with that thread.
Thanks. Great question, and I'm really happy you brought that up. So the best that we know is that crops were domesticated from the wild species about 10,000 years ago. And they're domesticated across multiple different points around the world. And they happen to also correspond with the points that human civilization sort of originated. So agriculture evolution and human civilization evolution basically converged in the same spots. So these are called Vavilov centers, named from Nikolai Vavilov, one of the scientists from Russia, about 120 years ago or so. And so he went around the world looking for where potential origins of agriculture was. And so he postulated that the area where we have the wildest diversity of related crop species is probably the area that these crop species evolved from. And so he identified a couple of them located around the world. So one of them is in, let's say, southern Mexico. And this is where maize and beans and tomatoes and squash and peppers and vanilla came from. Another one would be in India, let's say northern India. There's a bunch of different plant species that came from there. Some types of sorghum, some types of legumes, pigeon peas. Another famous one is often in Asia, so kind of southern China, northern Vietnam, where rice and soybeans and other staple commodities came from. And maybe the most famous one is sort of the Eastern Mediterranean in like Turkey, Israel, Syria, Lebanon. And that's where wheat, barley, peas, lentils all originated.
Now you just used a juxtaposition. You called things wild or domesticated. Tell us what that means. How do you domesticate a plant?
This is super interesting, and we don't really know how it happened originally. But let's say in maize, for instance, or corn, there's a wild ancestor. It's called teosinte. We know it's a wild ancestor because the genome of teosinte and the genome of maize share, maybe 90% of the genome. So you know that they're somehow related. And you can look at the physical structure. It looks like a small little corn plant, but with this tiny little ear. And so what we imagine happened was hunter-gatherers, pre-civilization, were going around looking for different foods, different seeds that they were eating. And they would find these grains from these ancestral plants that were just smaller, and they would pick them. And over time, somehow they started picking the ones that with maybe a larger seed or more grain per ear. And then there was a transition that we don't really understand from picking and harvesting to picking and planting.
So you're saying that they were driving a kind of accidental evolution where they were the survival of the fittest, and they were biasing their selection towards the kinds of traits that they wanted in these plants.
Yeah, that's our best understanding now is what was happening 10,000 years ago, more or less.
So fast forward, at some point, humans got, I'm fast forward to like 150 years ago, we went from kind of accidentally domesticating plants to doing it much more consciously. I think of sort of what you would call the origins of plant breeding.
Yeah.
A few hundred years ago, sort of depending on how you count.
Yeah, and so this is Gregor Mendel's work, a famous monk from Germany, and he was looking at peas. And if you actually do intentional selection rather than kind of doing it based on saving the bigger seeds, but he was looking at peas. Some of them are yellow seeded peas, some of them are green seeded peas, some have wrinkled skins, some have smooth skins, and he was wondering, if I select specific flowers and I move pollen from one plant to the other plant, how does it change how these, we call them traits, which is sort of the visual expression of the genes, so yellow seeds versus green seeds. How do those traits change if I move genes around? And then he was the first person that we know about that documented that you can move genes from one plant to another plant of the same species and influence some of their physical characteristics that come out of it.
But he was doing that through essentially sexual crossover between the plants.
Moving pollen from one flower to the other flower.
Now, fast forward to 10 years ago-ish, sort of 30, depending on exactly how you count, we've started to be able to actually edit the genes of plants, right?
At the higher level, you can use different technologies. You can use CRISPR, for instance, and you can do gene editing of individual genes within the genome. But maybe 99+% of all plant breeding is using the exact same methods that Gregor Mendel and our human ancestors, proto-civilization, have been doing. So in reality, not much actually has changed in plant breeding for 10,000 years.
Humanity has been spending the last 10,000 years getting better and better plants, sort of guiding the plants to be what we want. So no problems, we're all done.
Under ideal conditions, for sure. But humans also do a very good job of changing their environment. Varieties that we've been breeding for the past 10,000 years may or may not be adapted to the climates that we're creating into the future.
So some of the things, now that we're causing the world to change, things get hot, things might get cold, pest conditions change. What else? Disease, the amount of water that's available. Are there other things that are also changing?
Human dietary preferences are changing, more proteins concentrated in certain parts of the world. Now we're looking at biofuels, so how can we produce more carbon from the plants beyond just the grain that we're eating, so the leaves and the stems. So environments are changing, and also human kind of requirements are also changing at the same time.
And could we just leave some large companies like Syngenta or Monsanto to sort of solve this problem for us, and then we just buy the seeds that they make?
The Syngentas and Monsantos, they're really targeting a very specific market, and that's going to be kind of the large industrial farms in North America and Europe and maybe some parts of Brazil or China, whereas maybe 99% of farmers in the world are smallholder farmers. So these are farms that are managed by one family, usually maybe 1 or 2 acres, and they have a very diversity amount of crops that they're producing. And these are maybe billions of people around the world, and they're living principally in the global south. And these larger companies aren't targeting really the products that are geared for them.
So when 99+% of the farmers in the world aren't having plants being bred for their changing needs, who's doing that for them?
That's where my organization comes in. So I work for an organization called the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, part of a consortium called the Alliance of Biodiversity International, and my organization, which the abbreviation is CIAT, C-I-A-T. And we're part of a larger umbrella organization called the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, which is a horrible name, has an equally horrible acronym of CGIAR. It has nothing to do with cigars. It's the largest consortium of intergovernmental nonprofit research organizations in the world. We have offices and gene banks based in all of these Vavilov centers I was talking to you about earlier, and we house basically the world's supply of genetic diversity for maybe crops that feed 70% of calories into humanity.
So some people may have heard of the sort of Noah's Ark, these gene banks that store humanity's experiences with plants over time so that we don't lose them. Is that this organization that you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. And the famous one would be the Doomsday Vault. That's housed up in the Arctic Circle in Norway, where it's the backup vault to all of our other vaults that we have around the world. And they house the world genetic diversity of the most important plant species that to human beings, and also the history of 10,000 years of civilization. So they're really cool places.
Well, thanks for doing that.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
So CIAT, your organization, is doing work on a nonprofit basis, helping plants get bred for the changing conditions for these much smaller farmers, which is, as you say, most of the farmers and probably the bulk of the farmland in the world.
Yeah. And at least maybe 50 to 60% of all agriculture production happens from these farmers.
So tell us a little bit about a prototypical example, just so we have something to get really specific about. What is a plant that a lot of these farmers would care about, that their communities would care about, that they grow, that they really need, that the conditions are changing on them, and that you're trying to help meet them where they're headed, where their needs are headed through this kind of plant breeding?
Yeah, sure. So I'm personally based out of our offices in Arusha, Tanzania. And a lot of the work that we do in that part of Africa is focusing on common beans. So the technical term is Phaseolus vulgaris. This would be like black beans, pinto beans that we'd have here in the United States, red kidney beans. This is kind of like maybe a crop that we don't eat in the United States on a daily basis, but in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically in East Africa, this is providing something like 90% of all the human proteins that's required for most of the population, so something like 50 to 100 million people. So it's a very, very important commodity. On top of that, beans, they're part of this really wonderful family of plants called legumes, and they have this symbiosis relationship with these bacteria that live in the soil, and they can take nitrogen from the atmosphere, and they can take it out of the air and put it into the plants, which then puts it into proteins, which then puts it into food that people eat and also animals eat. And this process is one of the most important biological processes in the world. Not only does it give us protein in food, but it also provides fertility and nitrogen to the soil to feed, the animals and microbes, and also, sequester some nitrogen and carbon in there as well.
So before we go deeper, now that we've sort of got to the present, to plant breeding for these small farmers around the world, you're living in Tanzania. How did you come to be excited about this and to be living in Africa? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, so my mother's from Argentina and my father's Mexican-American, and I spent a lot of my childhood kind of rummaging around, our ancestral homelands in Mexico and South America. And my family comes from smallholder farmer families' backgrounds, multiple generations ago. But so when I was going there, I was exposed to sort of this lifestyle. And I did a bunch of traveling, and some of my traveling I was doing was in sub-Saharan Africa. And I was realizing and witnessing that some of the poorest places on the world were also the places that were kind of overlapping with these smallholder farming systems. And I was thinking that, if I could do one thing with my life productively, it would be to try to see if we can make a dent in human poverty. And the thing that I found for me that was the most important was if I could invest my academic and intellectual resources to understanding how we can produce more food from the same piece of land, that could be potentially a powerful tool to be able to use against, poverty, to be able to address some of those issues.
That's beautiful, and I'm really grateful that you and people like you do things like that.
Thanks. Yeah.
So now we're out in a field, might be in Tanzania, and you're looking at a bean and it's growing up. What do you look at the bean to try to figure out how healthy it is, how much yield it will actually produce, how many calories it will actually give, whether it's diseased or not? What are the kind of things that you look at in a bean when you're just out there with a clipboard? Specifically, do you measure it with a ruler? Do you take a photograph? How many beans a day can you look at? Tell me a little bit about just how that process tends to go for a breeder.
So this is the same process using the same tools, our eyes and hands and ears and nose and mouth, again, that people have been doing for 10,000 years. So if we're looking at beans, we're going to be looking at sort of how fast the beans germinate out of the ground and emerge. We'll be looking at sort of how fast they turn into larger plants, how big the plants are, how green the plants are, how many flowers each plant is producing, how many of those flowers are then transitioning into pods, how many pods are full with the grain, the beans, how many beans are actually in each pod, how big they are, how round they are. Throughout the growing season, are diseases coming in? So the leaves turning yellow or brown? Do they have spots? Do they not have spots? Are bugs coming in? Do they have aphids? Do they not have aphids? Under heat and drought stress, are they wilting or are they staying kind of turgid and erect? So kind of really using all of our senses to really understand what plants are, how they're responding to their environment.
How long does it take to just score, like you're talking about a pretty complex score there?
Yeah.
Because there's a bunch of different dimensions you just named, and I bet you that's not all of them.
Yeah.
How long does it take to score a bean plant? You're standing in front of a bean plant. Like, typically, for someone who's good at it, for someone who does this a lot, and that means that there's not that many people who do it a lot so that they're really good at it, how long does it take?
Well, if we're looking at one individual plant, it could probably take a couple of minutes to do that. But we really look at plant populations rather than individuals, right? Because you want a batch of seeds that can basically produce the same type of plant all the time. So we're usually looking at plots, and the plots can be maybe between, let's say, 4 to 5 meters. So that's going to be like 20 feet, something like that. And there may be like a couple of hundred plants within that plot. And that would take maybe 3 to 5 minutes to score an individual plot, and about the same amount of time to score an individual plant if we're just looking at single plants. And we've got maybe a couple of thousand of plots, so in the order of several million plants in a one kind of average size breeding field.
How does it take the same amount of time to score a plot, which has hundreds of plants, as to score a single plant? Is that because you're just doing like super rough averaging, because you're kind of standing back and kind of like, it looks like on average there are about 3 flowers there, even though some might have 5 and some might have 0?
Yeah, so breeding's a generational cycle. So when you start the breeding process, you have a lot of genetic diversity. And so if you plant a plot, you might have some plants that are really, really tall, other ones that are really short, ones with really, long pods, ones with smaller pods. And so you're looking at individual plants at this case. So which of these individual plants across this plot has the characteristics that you're looking for?
I see. So when you're looking at a plot with 100 plants, you're not really scoring the whole plot. You're gravitating to the best plant in the plot and scoring that one.
And then you may bring that individual plant to a greenhouse, planting them in pots in a greenhouse, and then looking at how those plants in those pots are growing. Then after we're doing some more, again, moving the pollen around, doing the pollination and doing the breeding process, then we want to go back to the field to test them again, and then we'll plant a population, maybe about a couple hundred seeds, and then we'll look, how much diversity do we have there. And we do that cycle over and over and over again. And each cycle that we're doing, we're purifying the genetics within that individual seed and all those groups of seeds that we have, until eventually we have what we call the stable breeding population. So if you take that bag of seeds and you plant them wherever you are, you're more or less going to get the same types of plants. More or less all of them will look the same. And then once we get to that point, then we're looking at entire plots almost the entire time.
I just want to zoom out for a second. That sounds like a lot of work. Let's just pretend for a second. Again, I appreciate that you're spending and other people are spending their lives on this. Let's say you all stopped. What happens to the farmers? What happens to their communities? Like, does the world care? Like, what are the ramifications for this, which I think might be best seen by just imagining if you stopped, what happens over the next 30 years?
Yeah. So a lot of these crops that farmers use, they save over and over and over again after multiple generations. In the U.S., we'd call these heirloom crops. The technical term would be land races. And so there's a lot of land races, and the land races can be quite stable. The issue with land races is that they can be particularly sensitive under certain communities towards new climate-induced shocks, right? So a lot of these land races have been evolving in the same area for thousands of years, which means over that stable climate for thousands of years, they do really, really well. But the climate we have now isn't the climate that we had 10 years ago, and it's not going to be the climate we have in 20 years. And so now those land races are not going to be productive very much longer. And so we really need to understand what the genetic potential of those land races are now, how the climate's changing, and how we can then adapt those land races or newer varieties to meet the needs they have now, but also to the climate that we have in the future.
And what would happen to the farmers and their communities and to the world more generally if that didn't happen?
It'd be very bad. So a lot of these communities, as I was saying before, smallholder farming communities, you would have a typical farmer would be a family, let's say 5, a husband and wife and 3 kids. And they would be farming maybe 2 to 3 acres, or maybe 1 to 3 acres. And they would have, let's say, some sort of legume for protein. So they'd have beans in East Africa. They'd have some sort of grain for starch. So this would be corn or maize. They'd have a small plot of vegetables, maybe a couple of fruit trees, some grasses they're growing to feed their livestock, maybe a couple of cows, a couple of goats. And so most of the entire food that they consume for the whole year, they grow on farm. Whatever they have left over from eating, they would sell, and they would use that money then to fund, let's say, their children going to school, or clothes, or medicine, or shoes, things, everyday things. So if agriculture production in these communities diminish, that means you get less income coming into these farming households. And so you need to make a decision about which of your 3 kids you want to send to school. You need to make a decision about, okay, do I, feed my family tonight, or do we, take our child who's suffering from malaria to the hospital so that we can buy the medication? And that's just with sort of income streams. And then food, if you're reducing, agricultural productivity, not only are you not getting the income from surplus, but you're also potentially not getting the total quantity of food that you need. And then you need to get that from somewhere else. So that means you need to leverage whatever cash you have available, maybe sell a cow, sell a goat, sell a chicken, in order to buy the food that you need to supplement what you didn't grow. So these communities are really interesting. They're very diverse. They're really wonderful places, but they can be very fragile places.
And it seems like mass migration of people out of the sort of hottest parts of the world, the sort of, top part of the global south probably, would get triggered if these people didn't have enough to eat.
We're seeing that all the time. And in the place where I live, in northern Tanzania, southern Kenya, there's 2 rainy seasons. A long rain, which starts in March and goes until about June or July. Then there's a brief dry season, and there's a short rain, which starts again in October and goes into about November, December. And so farmers have been used to these 2 production cycles, a long rain and a short rain. Over the past 15 years that I've been there, the short rain had been becoming more and more erratic, to the point now where farmers, the entire northern Tanzania, no longer plant in the short rain because they don't know if their labor is going to be productive. If I'm going to buy fertilizer, going to buy seeds, going to till the field with my hands, or hire out labor or a tractor or a cow, is that going to be a good return on my investment? And most of the communities there are saying no, it's too unreliable. And so if you imagine if these families, all of a sudden you're cutting out half of the food that they produce and half the income that they're generating across tens of millions of families across this region, then this becomes a real big problem really quickly. Mm-hmm. And that's just from my personal experience in one part of the world that I've been living in.
So let's go back now 5 years. Tell us a little bit about how you met us, how you met X, and how you met Mineral, which at the time was a project at X. What were your earliest memories of those interactions?
So the way that we met is that I was based in East Africa, and we were maybe my work in the technology space in agriculture started about 2014. And a really well-trained agronomist, that's an agricultural scientist or a plant breeder, you can show them a field of plants, and within 30 seconds, they can tell you exactly what's going on. Oh, this one has this disease that's got this nutrient deficiency. This is this pest. And so there's really amazing amount of knowledge that you built up over a lifetime of looking at plants and studying plants. We were having a hard time because a lot of the newer generation aren't as interested in some of these more traditional aspects of agricultural sciences. They're more interested in more of the new novel gene stuff, the genomics and genetic stuff. And so we were wondering as a as a field of study, how can we, gain more interest in some of the newer generation to be able to learn some of these older things
and preserve some of this knowledge from some of these experts.
Yeah, some of these people, these breeders have been doing this work for 40 years, and now they're retiring with 40 years of institutional knowledge. You can't replace that.
And no one to pass it on to.
No one to pass it on to. And so, we just started thinking about, well, what if can we take a picture? Can we emulate what breeders are seeing through pictures? And then can we use that to kind of digitize some of their knowledge? Mm-hmm. So then I was originally from California, and I was here on home leave one time. It's a funny story because I was actually sitting in a hot tub of a friend of mine, drinking a beer, and he had another friend of his that was coming. His name was Neil. I can't remember his last name. Neil Treat.
Uh-huh.
So Neil came in, and we just started talking about the work that we're doing, and he happened to be an employee of X. And I was talking about the work that I was doing, and the work. Can we get into computer vision and start using AI to help us, retain some of this knowledge from plant breeding? And he said, "Oh, actually, there's a new ag division within X that I work in, and I'm sure they would love to talk to you about this." And so that evening, he connected me with Elliot Grant, who was then the lead of the group at X that became Mineral, and we started a kind of like an email correspondence, jumped on some calls, and then next thing you know, we're phenotyping plants in Tanzania a couple of years later.
All right, so let's talk about how you get from, just post hot tub to phenotyping lots of plants in Tanzania. I think the first place you were doing something with X, was it Mexico or Colombia?
It was in Mexico.
Mexico. So tell us, what kind of technology did we bring with us? It's okay. I bet you it was janky at first. We often pride ourselves on getting out into the world as quickly as possible, but with something that's highly imperfect, getting feedback from experts like you, so we can make it better. So I'm curious, what was it? What did we bring? How was it janky? What was interesting about it?
So we had a concept, right? We had a concept of we think you can take an image and you could probably get really useful information that breeders can use from it. And Mineral was saying we've got technology that we think we can leverage that's kind of doing similar things. And at the time, Mineral was developing this rover. It was like a car, a small car, kind of lifted up a little bit, had these googly eye lights and had all these cameras inside. You'd kind of move it through a field and it would take all these images. And the images were coming out pretty cool. You could see really high definition.
It was like a golf cart on steroids on stilts?
More or less, yeah, with kind of off-road wheels that would go through the mud.
Yeah.
And they demonstrated some of the images that they were collecting, and it looked like some interesting information could be drawn from it. So I was in Mexico at the time, and we have a lot of our wheat breeders and corn or maize breeders were there. And so we're talking to them about what we could do. And they said, well, this seems really interesting. We should bring them down and we should see about collecting some data here. So we got
in Mexico.
Okay. And so we brought over some of the staff. Erica Bliss, who was a key person at Mineral, came down, and we started kind of brainstorming about what would be possible. Eventually, we brought a couple of these rovers down, and we had one running through the fields in wheat, one running through the fields in maize. And we're able to formulate with the breeders actually what are you seeing and what could be derived from computer vision.
So they have very long kind of legs under these rovers, these golf carts on steroids. Were they go so tall that they could go over wheat and corn, or did they have to go next to the wheat and corn?
So the wheat worked. So I think it was maybe about 5 or 6 feet up to the bottom of the rover, and that worked well for wheat. So we're able to kind of move it through wheat with the wheat kind of being in the field, no problem. We had some problem with the maize or the corn because some of these plants are 3 meters tall, so maybe 9 feet tall. And the rover just couldn't get that high.
Its tummy was a little bit lower than that.
It was too low. Yeah, it was too low. So they made this really interesting kind of hybrid rover. It kind of reminded me of, I don't know, you remember Short Circuit, the movie from the 80s with Johnny Five?
Yeah.
It reminded me of Johnny Five, where it was this kind of low wheel device. There's a big long metal neck and little kind of googly eye cameras like Johnny Five had. And they had that guy, and they kind of pushed him in between the corn rows. And so it's now looking on the side, one eye going to the right, one eye going to the left. And you're literally pushing this thing through the field, and it's taking images on the side from the corn.
We still have that downstairs.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was really funny.
So what did you learn from that? What kind of feedback did you give them about, here's what we wish? I guess the first feedback was, hey, this doesn't fit over the maze.
Yeah, right.
And I guess so they made this sort of googly-eyed one pole things, as you just described. What was sort of the evolution after that? What did you want? Did you want it to go faster? Did you wish the rover was smaller or cheaper, that it could understand the pictures better? Like, what were the sort of fantasies in those early days?
So we know we wanted to have our applications more towards smallholder farmers. The initial rovers were a really good fit for some of our central research hubs. So we have these major hubs all over the world where we have the gene banks. We have ability to house larger technology, right? Like a rover or a drone. But a lot of our really, really important breeding stations are really kind of way out in deep rural areas, like in Tanzania. And eventually we wanted to actually be able to use technology to start imaging plants on farmers' fields so we can understand also how the varieties are performing actually in situ on a farmer's field. And so we wanted to think about how we can transition technology from a rover to a mobile phone, knowing that smartphones are available almost everywhere in the world, and the technology is likely going to be the same. And can we take that technology and apply it then to a smartphone?
So using the rovers, gathering millions of pictures of beans or whatever that we're looking at, making sure to score those really carefully using experts so that Mineral could get great at knowing what it was looking at in a picture, and then putting those smarts onto a phone so that someone could pull out the phone from their pocket standing over a bean and get pretty close to or maybe the same level of information as that rover was getting?
Yeah, exactly. So with the example of wheat, we're able to look at a spikelet of wheat. So a wheat's got this big kind of like fuzzy spike that comes off. And each individual spike has a bunch of smaller, tiny little spikes that have each spike has one little grain of wheat. So the rover was able to image in an entire field, and we could count the actual numbers of spikelets. And it's physically impossible for a human being to do that because there's just too many. One spike has maybe a couple hundred of spikelets on it, and one field's got a couple of million spikelets in it. Human beings just cannot do that. So the rover was able to do that, which was really amazing because now we can really see how, and each one of those, the greater density of spikelets on a plant has a strong indication about how much that will yield. And under heat and drought stresses, plants abort a lot of these spikelets. So under these really kind of climate kind of stressed conditions, we can measure how much spikelet abortion was happening. So it's giving us really, really good information about how the plant performance was. So I asked Erica, hey, can we do this on a smartphone? And she says, well, we don't know yet. We know we can do it on a rover. We don't know if we can do it on a smartphone yet, but maybe the rover can transition us into moving the technology over towards smartphones.
I remember that the team was working on a number of things, but of course, when they started, it wasn't clear which of them were really going to matter. One of the ones I remember them asking the question about was, if we were to look at these plants every week instead of just once or twice during the season, would that matter? I remember they were asking, well, if we're going to see them many times during the season, does it matter if you go past this maize plant and then you go past the next one, plant A and then plant B and then plant C, can you just treat them like they're kind of all the same, or do you have to sort of name them so that when you come back a week or two later and look at them again, you know that plant A is plant A and that plant B is plant B, so you can see how it's changed?
Yeah.
Like for a bunch of those different kinds of things, do you remember which ones mattered maybe more than you thought, or which ones we thought would matter and turned out not to matter?
Very good points you're bringing up. So traditionally, if we look at breeding traditionally, right, you go to the field, you send somebody who's really well trained, just with their eyes and a pen and paper, and they're making notes down. They have to do that for thousands of breeding plots, and each breeding plot's again taking 3 to 5 minutes. And at the beginning of the day, it's cool, your eyes are fresh, it's probably fine. Midday, if you're in one of our stations in northern Nigeria, it's going to be 102 degrees, 105 degrees. You're going to be sweating. It's hot. It's dusty. So you just want to get out of there as fast as you can. So you're just taking shortcuts and going through. And it's really time consuming and difficult. So you get maybe 1 or 2 data points per season of how the plants are performing. The work that we're doing with Mineral with the rovers, you could image the plants on a higher cadence because you're not having to worry about people getting tired or getting too hot. So we're able to go through, I think on a bi-weekly basis, 2 times a week, go through the field. And we're now, instead of getting really discrete points across the whole growing season, we can get actually continuous data, near continuous data where we get a curve. So rather than having a point here and point there of, let's say, how many pods are in a plant, we get a whole pod establishment curve and pod sort of development curve. And when I was showing this data to the breeders, they said, we've never even seen this data before because we could never get it. So this was not just better data, but it was actually data that we never had even seen before. And so now we're able to see the relationship of the development of the pods or flowers or pods as the season's progressing. And this was really novel data for us, and it allowed us to do a lot of really interesting things. For example, I was talking to you before about kind of drought stress indicators with plants. And so with beans, as with other plants, whenever heat or drought happens, they abort their flowers because they're just trying to preserve their resources, all the water that they have or whatever, to a more smaller amount of flowers. So the grains that they have left, they can concentrate the effort in them. And so an important indicator of sort of heat or drought stress resilience, of climate resiliency, is how many flowers did you start with at the beginning of the season? How many flowers did you have at the end of the season? How many pods did you have at the beginning? How many pods did you have at the end? So the more...
So if it gave up halfway through the season on itself.
Exactly. So if you had 100 flowers at the beginning, at the middle you had 50 flowers, half of them just got lost because they said, this is too much, we're out of here. Yeah. And if you have 25 of those flowers that had pods, then another 50% said, we're out of here, it's too hot, too dry for us. So what we're able to see is that curve of pods and flowers over time. We can actually see, these plants, specific varieties, are retaining their flowers more under heat and drought stress, and that's resulting in greater number of pods at the end of the season under heat and drought stress. So it was showing us a very strong indicator of that these are the plants the varieties that we need to use because there's some of the genes there that are encoding really strongly for heat and drought adaptation.
Was Mineral primarily helping by counting the flowers, or was it also trying to measure things about the flowers?
Principally, it was counting. I mean, we do measurements. You do also measurement things like with diseases, how disease progression occurs. But just the simple thing is counting flowers. It sounds really, really simple, but it's really, really, really hard to do at scale because they're so small and there's so many of them. And just humans are not good at doing that.
You made me think about something earlier I hadn't thought of before. You were trying to take these tiny little steps in plant evolution space. Mm-hmm. And if humans get tired and it's dusty by the early afternoon, and there's non-trivial noise introduced into the data just from when during the day they took the data, and there's probably other factors besides how hot it is.
People actually coming in.
Different people. Yeah. Then being able to remove some noise and standardize, like let's say from person to person, even if each person was perfectly consistent within themselves, that standardization and the denoising might itself move you from being able to climb in the evolution space to not.
Yeah.
Right? Because you have to have a signal that's clear enough that you can actually pick what to lean towards, which plants to try to encourage in the next generation of plants, right?
Well, this is the precise problem that we're trying to solve for, is that breeding is a very long process. Historically, it takes about 10 years to develop a new variety of bean, for instance. But we know that we have to reduce, the number of years it takes to develop a new variety. One of the problem is the principal data is phenotyping, which is the data that we're generating now. And there's so much error in human phenotyping data that signal to noise ratio isn't strong enough. So we end up making bad decisions about which varieties to move forward in the breeding cycle because we don't have a clear picture or understanding of what the performance is like. So we end up having to repeat seasonality over and over and over again in order to capture the correct amount or the quality of data that we need. So if we can reduce the noise and increase the signal, then we can quickly segregate the varieties across 1,000 plots. We can say, okay, actually, these 500 we can just get rid of because they're bad. And of these, maybe only these 50 that are really, really, really performing really well, we can move those forward. And so now we just eliminated 2 or 3 years of our breeding cycle because we just eliminated so much bad stuff because we now can pick the signal out over the noise.
And just to make sure we're following, when you say you drive this through phenotyping is just the measurement of the physical manifestation of the plant?
Yeah. So, all living things have genes. And so we have a genome, all the DNA that's in us. And that genome can be expressed in different ways. If you are given a lot of food as a human being when you're younger, you have all the nutrition you need so you get up really tall. And, people that are nutritional, they don't have as much nutrition when they're younger. They don't quite reach the height that they get stunted. They get stunted. And so this is going to be a phenotypic expression. So plants are the same way. They can get stunted. They can be in the perfect environment. So they can be expressed in different ways. That's the visual expression of the environment and the genotype. And that's what we're picking up with phenotyping. We're able to collect data on sort of those physical expressions.
So let's fast forward to today. How did it go? Is this capability that you wished could be on the phone? And if so, tell us how it's playing out.
Yeah, I mean, we just finished analyzing, our 2 years of working with minerals specifically on this one particular problem with phenotyping on a smartphone. And their answers were resoundingly that we can do it really, really well and really accurately. So there's a measure that we use called heritability, which is if you measure, the phenotype of somebody, you can pump it through a calculation and it can tell you of that phenotype, of the diversity. Let's say you have one bean that produces 10 beans, one bean plant that produces 20, one produces 15. Of that diversity, how much of that diversity is due to the genetic factor versus how much is due to random error? This is called heritability. And so that's a measure of how good basically we are at breeding.
For example, humans, our height is fairly heritable, right? How funny we are might be a lot less heritable.
Exactly. That's exactly what's happening with plants. And so we want to basically look at traits that have a higher level of heritability. With too much noise, that heritability is really difficult. So we say, well, we don't really know if this flower abortion is really because of genes, or maybe just because it was just random noise. And so what we're able to prove is that actually when you use the computer vision phenotyping, you're getting a higher heritability than you would have during normal sort of visual phenotyping.
You can kind of focus in on the plants that not only have the physical characteristics that you want, but also the physical characteristics you want that it's worth focusing on because you're likely to get more of that thing if you push them into the next generation.
Exactly.
Focus on those plants.
Is the work that we're doing actually being driven by genetic improvement that we're also doing?
As opposed to random chance.
And what we're finding is that this is happening. And we really wanted to test this. So we took some smaller plots and we had some of our technicians actually go on their hands and knees and physically count the flowers and pods every day because we really wanted to know what's the absolute value that these things have. And so when we look at the absolute value and we measure the heritability, this is as good as heritability could get. And we measure the heritability with the smartphones, they're maybe like plus or minus 2 or 3% off. So almost as good as you can get with a smartphone.
And I assume you can go kind of order of magnitude 100 times as fast by just walking a phone through the field past some beans as crawling on your hands and knees with a clipboard past these same beans, right?
So, well, first you cannot do it by hand. So you're already infinitely better there. And then if you're just doing kind of visual estimation with your eyes and writing it down, it takes 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes. We can image an entire plot in less than 30 seconds. So you just go through and take some photos, and you get every plant, every flower, every pod in the entire plot in less than 30 seconds. So it's just orders of magnitude greater efficiency. And then just the accuracy that you get is much better. And it's hard to say how much better it is when you can't actually do it at all from a manual method.
So right now, the people using these tools that came from Mineral on these phones are all still professionals. They're breeding professionals. Can you imagine a day where these kinds of tools were in the hands of the farmers themselves, so that this could be a much more distributed process that the farmers could participate in?
Well, so there's a couple of problems with the existing breeding systems. And so existing breeding systems and the methodologies, the scientific methods we use and all the calculations that we use were developed in the United States, mostly like Iowa and Illinois, Kansas in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And so a farm in Iowa and a breeding station in Iowa more or less looks and behaves and acts the same. So if you get some sort of genetic improvement from your breeding program on a research station in Iowa, you put it to a farmer's fields in Iowa, it's going to perform more or less the same. The issue we have in a lot of these smallholder farming communities is that they're very, very diverse. So you can have farms that are on a hill, farms that are in the valley, farms on acidic soil, farms on sandy soil, farms on really black, wet, sticky clay. And so there's so much diversity in these smallholder farming settings. And do they have cows? Do they not have cows? Because that really affects how much plants and how much soil fertility is there. And so we get an incredible amount of diversity in these smallholder farming systems, and we have a very, very limited amount of environmental diversity in our research stations. So what we've measured, some of our best measurements we have, is the correlations between the yields on station and what we're measuring on farm is between 8 and 40%. So if we were getting, let's say,
it's weakly correlated.
Weakly correlated. If you're getting 100 kilos or let's say 100 pounds of beans on a research station, you'll only be getting those same varieties on a farmer's field. Maybe you're getting 8 to 40 pounds of beans.
Well, you were saying 100 before.
100 before on a research station. Right. We measure on a research station, we're getting 100. You take that same variety, you put it on a farmer's fields, you're getting maybe 8 to 40 pounds.
Incremental or total?
Total.
So that seems really bad and like strongly negatively correlated. If you were expecting 100 pounds, it's because it's grown so carefully. I just understood.
Yeah.
It's grown so carefully under kind of idealized circumstances that you have a rough estimate, but a highly imperfect estimate, but it's going to be a lot less good. You just don't know how much less good.
We hope it's not going to be that much less good, but it's a lot less good. And some of the things is that when we're controlling a lot of environment. We're controlling the soil. We're fertilizing. We're adding irrigation.
Perfect
we're doing
water.
Perfect everything. Putting using pesticides and herbicides to make sure that we really know what's going on.
Which the farmers can't afford.
They can't afford that. But the genes know what's happening. And so what we think is probably happening is that we're selecting so strongly for certain traits, certain plant performance on a research station, that inadvertently we're not selecting for the traits that are imbibing or imbuing sort of soil acidity tolerance or specific adaptations that farmers need specifically on their soils.
Right. If you want extreme drought tolerance, shouldn't you be breeding them with very little water?
We can do that a little bit by having a couple of small plots.
You just don't water.
We can not water it, but what about not watering it and acidic soils?
Right. So you want all the different combinations.
Yeah, because in acidic soils, the roots don't grow very well because it's too acidic. They get aluminum toxicity, all kinds of nasty problems. So you compound sort of negative effects and complexities when you go onto farm than you do when you go into research.
But you
station.
need that data to know how it's really going to play out. So it sounds like you wish that every farmer in Tanzania had one of these and was sort of helping to compile the data as a group. Right?
Yeah. Well, so breeders have known this for a very long time, but there was logistic limitations to what they could do because remember, you need to have a trained expert in order to phenotype. And in a trained expert, let's say it takes 10 to 15 years in order to train that expert. That means you have very few of them and you have a lot of farmers. So it's just a scale problem. You can't scale that knowledge at the level that you need in order to execute on farm breeding.
Unless for free, you could do an over-the-air update where that expert appeared in everybody's pocket.
Exactly. Exactly. So this is why we wanted to move to smartphones. One is, a lot of the breeding stations that we're working on are in very poor locations. They don't have money to pay for a machine that we can use in the United States or in university settings. So that's one, moving to a smartphone. The other one is you can put it in your pocket. You have the same technology in this really, high-tech rover in your pocket that you can deploy on farms all over the world. And so now potentially we can take all those really interesting genetic diversity that we have, we can test it in situ on farmers' fields. We can quantitatively measure the plant performance across really diverse ecosystems, and we can collect farmer information about what they like and what they don't like about what they're seeing. Because not only can we collect imagery data, but we can also use voice and speech data to derive interesting and useful information from farmers.
So all of this is this really concrete example of computational agriculture. Let's back way up now. We're zooming out. What do you hope for the future of computational agriculture? Historically, we went from everyone doing it on a very bespoke basis. We had a period during which kind of mechanical aids like the plow was added. There was a sort of steam-powered or electric-powered mechanical additions that came in, like the combine. There was a whole biologics revolution more recently or a while ago, being able to fixate nitrogen, the Haber-Bosch process so that we could actually fertilize the fields. Where do you think computational agriculture fits in? Is this going to be an interesting sideshow? Is this the next big wave? What do you hope to see from this over the next 30 or 40 years for humanity?
If you think about all the processes you just talked about, it was a concentration of knowledge in a very small area, right? Haber-Bosch process, only very few,
This is the fixating of the nitrogen so that we could be making fertilizer at scale.
Taking nitrogen from the air, from the gas, putting it into a biological form that plants could use, that we can feed to plants so they can grow bigger. So it's such an immense and complicated process that only very few industrial manufacturing plants around the world can handle that. So you're concentrating things that have really been distributed. Nature's distributed them around the world with, as you talked about before, legumes do this naturally. And until maybe 1915, this was the only way that nitrogen got into the biosphere, is through this process. So we've kind of concentrated things through the Industrial Revolution into very small pockets. And so now with computational agriculture, what we can do is we can decentralize that again. So we can say, okay, rather than concentrating into these large nitrogen manufacturing plants, can we then start selecting for genes, understanding how these genes are expressing themselves in the environment, that are rather they're producing more nitrogen, doing the efficiency gains from taking the natural Haber-Bosch process called nitrogen fixation and putting that across these genes that we can then put into seeds and put around the world.
I see. You're saying there's been this period during which technology has helped agriculture and humanity feed itself, but it was a very centralized process. And you're hoping that this next wave allows for computation, maybe even robotics, to spread back out so that the help is distributed around the world rather than in these small number of centralized locations.
Exactly. I mean, biology is much more efficient than some of these industrial processes. The modern biological revolution is really tapping into what's possible with genes and with biological processes. So we need to go back towards agriculture, but agriculture is so complicated that you need more diversity of data sets. You need more ways of analyzing what's happening in the field to understand what's going on between the interactions of the genome, plus like the environment, plus like the culture that's been growing there. And so computational agriculture is really the only way we can make sense of all that richness and diversity of information, but we really need to generate that information at scale, and that really comes from a lot of these more technology, these simple technology devices. So mostly smartphones and other IoT tech that we can spread across the environment.
So just help us picture it for a second. What is this app that's on a smartphone? A breeder is standing in front of a bean plant. What happens? What do they see? Tell us, really concretely, what is that like on the phone? What does it look like?
Sure. So we try to make it really simple from the technicians in the field, because they have to image, thousands of plots. And so we want them to be really, really smooth as possible. So they take the phone, they open the app, and they select through, what crop are they using. Today is going to be beans. Okay, what plot are we doing? We're doing, these different plots. And they press a button that says go, and it starts taking a bunch of photos. And so they just walk through the field, and the phone the shutter opens up on its own and closes on its own. So as they go through, it takes a bunch of images. And so we do that across all the different plots the exact same way. We have a couple of different orientations. When plants are really small and they're just emerging out of the ground, we can get a really good top-down view. So we can look at how the plants are emerging, and then how the canopy is closing and how vigorous they're growing. And then once the plants are mature, like with beans, for instance, then the flowers start appearing underneath the plants.
So you have to go on the side.
You have to go on the side, so you switch to the side view, which is one of the issues with some of these rovers and drone technologies is they can't get underneath the plant. And so a smartphone, you can actually put the orientation so you can get underneath the plant. And you can pass it through the canopy, and you can see the different flowers and pods as they're developing.
And then what does a breeder see either in the moment, like after they've walked past, a bunch of plots, or later on their computer? Like, what do they see?
What's great about it is the breeders don't really know that there's a difference. All they know is that their heritability numbers and scores are coming out better, because we're reproducing the same type of data. If they want to get a number of, let's say, how many, which one of these genotypes is producing, better, they're getting the same type of data.
I see. So they walk down those rows past all those plots, and then the app just says, got it, thank you, smiley face.
Exactly. Data gets uploaded to the cloud. All the analytics happen in the cloud. The outputs then are accessible by the breeders. They click a download. The data is downloaded into like a Excel file or a CSV file, and for all that they know, that the data is the same as it was before.
Then an agronomist is looking at this, or particularly professional breeders looking at this, and whether that data was collected with a person with a clipboard or using these smartphones, they can't at that point tell, except that the data is much richer and much more accurate.
Exactly. So what they are seeing is that, relative to what they're doing before, their process of selection is much more data-driven, and it's producing results faster. Of course, the technician in the field, rather than having to spend 3 to 5 minutes in the field and having a lot of concentration, they're able to kind of, they can put music into their ears, and they can go through, they can take the the images, and it's much easier on the data collection side for sure.
So there's talk in society about artificial intelligence and the ways that it might make society better, but also lots of ways in which it's changing the world, and change can be complicated for people, especially if it's changing their jobs. I'd love to hear, how are the breeders feeling about this app, and how are the farmers feeling, both about the improved crops they're getting, but also as you're starting to do deployments into these farms, how are they experiencing the technology itself?
So far with the breeders and breeding technicians, they've been really positive. There's a lot of fear with AI, eliminating a bunch of jobs, but this is actually an AI enabling jobs, because the same people are doing the same thing. They're just doing it with less effort and getting more quality information and data from it. So from their perspective, it's actually making their life easier, but employing the same type of people. Same people doing more and better work.
So they're spending less time on their hands and knees in the dirt, and more time actually thinking about the data and what to do with
How the genes can be flowing. Yeah, more time doing what they should be doing, less time just doing kind of rote remedial work in hot, sweaty field, dusty fields. Yes. With the farmers, so we just started working with kind of the on-farm element. And these are really poor people in the middle of really rural areas, so they don't quite understand all the technology like we would have in the United States. But what they're saying so far is that they're really appreciating having a lot more input from them involved in the process. Because before, a breeder would come out, or a technician would come, scientist would come out, they would collect information, then go back to the field, and to the station, and maybe a couple of years later come with a finished variety. Here, you have this variety. Farmers grow it. It's not doing very well. This variety doesn't grow very well. And so it was very much a top-down. It wasn't a top-down because breeders wanted to do that. It was because there wasn't another way of doing it. So now we're able to kind of integrate farmers' feedback and opinion from the very beginning into the whole process, and we're able to have more conversational information about what farmers are seeing, what their preferences are doing, that can then influence what breeders
Right,
are.
it'll create a whole new layer of goodness and feedback.
One example of one of our breeders, a really wonderful breeder named Claire Munkankusi, based out of our Uganda office. She's been doing a lot of farmer questioning with farmers and having a lot of this work with farmers, not with us, but on her own. And she was able to pick out that what was really important to farmers was cooking time for beans. Because in these rural areas, a lot of the cooking is done with a 3-stone stove. So it's really 3 stones. You put the pot on top, you put some wood on the bottom, and you light a fire like you'd have when you're going hiking or camping. That's what most of the cooking happens in rural Africa this way. And, there's a couple of implications there. One is that wood needs to come from somewhere, and it's usually women and children that are going into the woods or wherever and getting the wood, bringing it back. So it's a lot of labor requirement. And then 2, it's being done indoors. So usually in some sort of, a hut, right? So like a mud-walled or brick-walled hut. And it's full of smoke, of course. And the smoke is one of the primary drivers of respiratory disease, mostly with women in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a lot of incentives to the more faster a bean cooks, the less wood is required in order to cook it. That means the less burden is placed on women and children. And that means the less time that the women are spending breathing in smoke in their environments. And so cooking time ends up being a really important thing that they're looking through. So now we're breeding beans that have faster cooking time.
That's a great example.
It's amazing. And you wouldn't know that unless you were with farmers every day asking them what is important quality about these beans for you. And so now we're coming back that's saying, actually, there's now frost tolerance is something we need to breed for, which you never knew about before. This is coming from our deployment or our development of on-farm components within this project that we're working on together. And we would have thought, okay, it's going to be, hotter and drier all the time. But actually, in some of the higher elevation sites, we're seeing that there's a lot more frost and potential hail. And so now we need to think through, okay, rather than just doing heat and drought stress requirements, we actually also need to think about potential frost damage and hail damage for other environments. And so this is something that we only really figured out over the past couple of months or so. And there's a lot of other insights we're getting from farmers. We're just starting the journey with farmers themselves, but this is just the tip of an iceberg, and it really can't be done efficiently at scale without technology playing a part.
You said 10 years was sort of what you were trying to do in terms of cycle times historically for breeding, whether it's a bean or something else. Obviously, you have to see the plant grow up and try at least 1 or 2 more cycles. It can't be 1 year, but could be 3 years, 4 years. Like if technology were perfectly helping you, whatever that exactly means, how much faster than 10 years do you think you could go at making meaningful improvements in plants?
Our best estimate we have now is 2 to 3 years. And that's not just from phenotyping. That's integrating different technology within our breeding stack. So phenotyping is a major one because that's a primary data that's driving selection processes. There's also genomics. How can we look at genomic data in combination with phenotyping data so we can understand which parts of the genomes are the ones that are really important so we can do something that's called marker-assisted selection. So we know that certain parts of the genome are the ones that we want to drive, and we can create basically these gene markers that kind of let us know that those genes are there and present. And so rather than having to grow them out into the field, all of them the next season, we run marker-assisted selection. We do a bunch of genomic analysis. We say actually only these seeds are the ones that actually have that genetic transfer. Because every time you transfer genes from one plant to the other plant, there's something like a 1 in a million chance that only the genes that you want are the genes that are actually going to be there. And you have no way of knowing that until you've grown them a couple of times. So using genomics and marker-assisted selection, we can kind of skip that process by understanding, okay, the genes actually only made it under these specific individuals within our breeding program. And then from there, we can also do genomic selection. So we can run the whole genome and understand some of these more predictive algorithms about what parts of the genome are really encoding for really important changes that we can actually lead to better breeding. So a combination of genomics and phenomics. So phenomics is the science around collecting phenotypic data. A combination of those two, we think we can get maybe 2 to 3 years, something like that.
Wow, that's an awesome speed up.
Yeah.
Other learnings, funny stories, other memories from this process, this journey that you've been on with X and Mineral?
Yeah, we do have a funny story. So when we were initially working with X and Mineral in the field in Tanzania, we were looking at taking photos just kind of like on your hands, hands and knees basically. And it was taking a really long time, and it was really time-consuming, back-breaking work. So we said to them, we really think we need to have some sort of mount for the phone so we can push through the field.
Like a selfie stick?
Like something like that. And the response was, no, we can't do that. Why not? Well, that's what we did originally. And we ended up with this big rover, and we're kind of like, we have PTSD from going on that route.
That was the Mineral team.
That was the Mineral team saying that. And I was like, well, you're not here like in the heat, like doing this, and this work kind of sucks on your back if you're doing it by hand. So I told the team, well, let's just do it anyways and see what happens. So we had we created this little like push cart. It's basically like a deconstructed bicycle, right? One wheel, little handles. You can mount phones. You can push it through the field. And I said, well, don't tell the Mineral team. All they should really be caring about is the quality of images and not how the images are taken. They said, okay, well, how do we talk about this? And one of our staff said, well, we should call it Bruno, because there's that Encanto,
don't talk about Bruno.
Don't talk about Bruno, yeah. And so, okay, well, it's going to be Bruno. And so we had these meetings, our team in Tanzania, the Mineral team here in Mountain View. And I would be asking them, oh, how does Bruno taking photos these days? Are these the ones that Bruno took? Yeah, these are the ones Bruno took. Oh, Mineral. We have a new technician, Bruno, and they're taking photos. How is the quality? Oh, yeah, he's great. We really keep doing more. Tell Bruno to keep doing what he's doing because he's producing really good data. And so eventually I had to tell them, I said, well, actually, Bruno's this push cart that we had developed. And they're like, whoa! And they're like, send us the schematics for that. And they got really excited. And I was talking to some of the people here. London, I don't remember London's last name, but I was talking to London about this, and he was getting really, really excited because he worked on some of the hardware stuff with them.
And as a denouement to your funny story, which I'd never heard before, the very first thing Mineral ever built
was a push cart, right?
Was a push cart with bicycle wheels. So what a wonderful full circle moment where after all of the complex technology, they came back to where they started, which was bicycle wheels and a phone in a field looking at plants.
They got the idea right from the beginning. Yeah.
Absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
Seriously, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
That was absolutely wonderful.
Great. Thanks for the conversation. Yeah.